Kristen Atchison here, and we're talking about social and emotional development in the lifespan. So the first piece we're going to talk about is temperament. Temperament is an individual's behavioral style or characteristic way of responding, and we typically talk about temperament in infancy. This is kind of sometimes thought about as a precursor to personality, but temperament has been kind of clustered into three different groups: easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. And temperament is a really good example of the interplay between nature and nurture. We know that temperament has a lot of biological roots, kind of how you respond in terms of these different ways really has a huge genetic component. But we also know that our temperament affects our environment, and our environment changes based on our temperament. So this is that kind of back and forth between nature and nurture. So the first people to kind of really group these temperaments were Thomas and Chess in a large study. And then Rothbard went back in afterwards and kind of solidified them a little further. There's newer ideas of temperament as well that have more to do with reactivity and affect. That Fox and his colleagues have done, but we're going to really focus on them a little bit more historical version of temperament for this intro class. So the first group we're going to talk about is easy kids. These kids quickly establish regular routines, they're fairly cheerful, and they're really adaptable to new experiences. If you have an easy child, and again, this is something that's more biologically based, somebody who adapts easily to new experiences, really regular routines, cheerful, you're going to be able to take that kid a lot more places than you'd be able to take a kid that's like a difficult kid. So difficult kids are irregular in daily routines, they're slow to accept new experiences, and they tend to react negatively and intensely. So if you're taking easy baby A to the park for the first time, that's a new experience. They're going to adapt easily to that, so they're more likely to enjoy the park and more likely for their parent to bring them back to the park. Whereas if you take difficult child B to the park and there's all the new kids and all the new sounds and all of the new everything, that child is more likely to react negatively intensely. And then that child's less likely to come back to the park because of these kinds of huge reactions. Kind of have to change the way that we're doing things. So because of the nature of temperament, it affects their environment, their nurture, because of how they adapt to these different things. If difficult children aren't given really good fits, really supportive fits, really places where kids are they're allowed to have this temperament, but they're also kind of gently pushed and kind of established, we can see that these kids could be at risk for adjustment problems. But again, this is when we don't have a goodness of fit between their nature and their nurture. We don't have a good environmental fit for who this kid is. If we're trying to make a difficult kid into an easy kid, that's where we can have problems. And the third group that they talked about were slow to warm up children. These are often inactive, have mild, low-key reactions to stimulus, and adjust slowly to new experiences, hence the slow to warm up name. Now you'll notice some of the things that they're talking about in here are the same things in that newer model of temperament. So again, Fox and his colleagues talked about reactivity. So that's going to be kind of that adapting to new experiences. They're talking about affect in terms of especially negative. We'll see that with the difficult kids versus the easy kids and the cheerful. Those kinds of reactions, these kinds of things. So again, they're talking about the exact same ideas. They're just kind of looking at it from a different angle than they looked at it before. Now, in the original Thomas and Chess study, what's important to note is when they broke these kids up into these three kind of clusters, what they found is that 35% of these kids did not fit the categories at all and really demonstrated unique blends of characteristics. And that's why we've seen this, one of the reasons we've seen this shift to this newer model from Fox and colleagues, because again, we're looking at kind of the characteristics themselves and where each child is on that characteristic, instead of easy children, difficult children, slow to warm up children. It's kind of the difference between a stage theory where you had to be all in one stage or all in another, and kind of that dynamic systems where you could be on different levels and different places it's the same kind of transition where we're going from this, you're in one of these three camps, to you can be this unique blend of these characteristics that kind of make up. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is attachment. Attachment is the close emotional bond between an infant and its caregiver, and this really may provide an important foundation for subsequent relationship development. There's some research that suggests that our kind of attachment as in infancy is really kind of a blueprint for our relationships in the future. So how we think how this relationship works, how it teaches us how other relationships should work. And so when we have good relationships early on, we'll see that we're going to expect those same kind of healthy relationships later on, is kind of that link. And this doesn't have to necessarily be with just the mother or the father. It can be really any caregiver. We can develop attachments to special people in our lives. And usually this makes us feel pleasure when we interact with them. And they're who we go to for this source of comfort in times of stress. Now, attachment research is definitely varied. We see research with infants. We see research with monkeys. We're definitely, some of that evolutionary perspective gets pulled in here. And one of the studies that we talk about in terms of attachment is Harlows Monkeys. So what Harlow did is he took infant rhesus monkeys, and they were taken away from their mother, and they were reared with one of two kinds of quote-unquote moms. The mom you see here is the terry cloth mom. She was cuddly, and the other mom was the wire mom. So basically they would have taken off this towel material, and it would have just been the wire outline. And what they did, and again, you have a video to watch on this, what they did was compare, they had the terry cloth mom with the food, the terry cloth mom without the food, the wire mesh mom with the food, and the wire mesh mom without the food. And both infants were given these different combinations. And what we found is they preferred the terry cloth mothers even if the wire mothers had the milk. So even in the conditions where the wire mother was given the milk, they still preferred that warm, snuggly terry cloth mommy. And this really tells us that contact and comfort is critical to attachment. Prior to this research, they really thought it was food. Whoever's feeding you is who you're going to make that attachment to. And what this showed that it's not food, because even when the wire mom had the milk, they still preferred the cuddly mom. Because again, this comfort is critical to attachment. And out of Harlow's study came other views, this ethological theory of attachment from Bowlby. And the primary assumption of this is that all species, and this is again kind of that, the ethological evolutionary perspective, that all species are born with species typical behaviors that promote social behaviors. And these really are innate signals that are products of our evolutionary history, and they increase our survival chance for the species. And that infant attachment really lays the foundation for all future relationships. And so again, for these monkeys, this clinging to their mother was something that they would have done in nature. This innate kind of ability to cling to their mother really promoted these social behaviors, increased the survival chances of the species, and then later laid a foundation for these other future relationships. This is what they were seeing with the monkeys. But they also have applied this to humans as well. And Mary Ainsworth was a student of Bowlby and has extended this to infants. That again, infants are born with species with typical behaviors and tendencies that promote social behaviors. And that these are a product of our evolutionary history. And they increase our survival chances for the species. And that again, this attachment lays the foundation for future relationships. And one of the things that Mary Ainsworth did was she looked at ways to measure attachment in human infants. And she developed this measurement called the strange situation. And again, you have a video to watch on this because it's strange. It's a strange situation. So it's hard to explain. You really need to see this. But basically what it is it's a series of separations and reunions with the caregiver. So we'll have mom and infant, or parent and infant, dad and infant, in this strange place that they've never been before, and kid can kind of explore. Then the researcher will come in, and then at one point mom will leave, and then mom will come back, and then the researcher will leave, and researcher will come back, and we'll have these kind of back and forths. And what they do is they measure how the infant responds to these reunions, to these separations. They look at the stress levels for the stranger's presence. They look at the stress levels for the caregiver's absence and return. They look at the levels of stress for how they play with toys and explore. And what we see is the 4 patterns of attachment come out. The first one is secure attachment, and this characterizes infants who may or may not cry when their parent leaves, but are easily comforted with their parent when they return. We'll also see that insecure attachment will have secure bases. Secure base is kind of this idea that the caregiver is a secure base to explore the environment. So if you've ever been at a playground and you see a kid who goes and plays and comes back and checks with their parent, and then goes back and plays and comes back and just grabs a hug real quick and goes back and plays and comes and gets a snack, that is using that secure base. This child's exploring their environment, but checking in with that secure base of that caregiver, so that they feel confident to do that in a safe way. Insecure attachments, there's kind of 3 of them, technically a little bit more too, but we'll see avoidant attachment, and this is our kids who are usually not distressed by the parental separation, and who often avoid the parent when they return. And again, that's why it's titled avoidant attachment, because there is this avoidance during the reunion period. We see resistant attachment. This is infants who remain close to the parent before departure, and they also display angry and resistive behavior when the parent returns. So this kind of clingy when they're there, but then really angry when they've left. And the last one is disorganized and disoriented, and this can actually be the greatest insecurity because they don't know how to respond. And this really, so we'll see confused, contradictory way of response, and this has to do with the fact that the parent usually is responding in confused and contradictory ways to the infant. So sometimes the parent will be supportive, sometimes the parent will be avoidant, sometimes the parent will be angry. We're not getting consistency from the parent, so the infant doesn't know what to expect. Because the infant doesn't know what to expect, the infant doesn't know how to behave. And so we see that attachment really comes out of these expectancies, how you expect this caregiver to behave to you. And secure attachment, we're going to see that warm comfort that we would have seen from the terry cloth moms, that comfort, that source of healthy attachment. We'll see different, more maladaptive behaviors from the parents. And so we'll see those expectancies in the infants in these insecure attachments. There's been other studies that have extended this research past just looking at the attachment at 15 months. So here's a study where they looked at attachment at 15 months, and they were either categorized as secure attachment or insecure attachment. And then they looked at, they asked the preschool teachers of these children at 3 years. So we're talking, a ways later. And what we're seeing is they're being described as different kinds of kids. And we see this relationship. This is a correlation. This is not an experiment. So kids were measured at one thing at one time and measured at something else at another time, and we're looking at the relationship between them in a correlational study. So kids that were measured as secure infants were described by their teachers as being leaders, sensitive to others, popular with peers, initiating activities, eager to learn, and self-directed. Infants that were measured to be insecure attached at 15 months were measured to have these observations by their preschool teachers as socially withdrawn, hesitant, less willing to learn, and less curious. So again, we're seeing these relationships between attachment at 15 months with their caregiver and the relationship with their peers later. Again, this is a relationship. We're not talking about cause and effect here, but we see this relationship, how the relationship with their parents may indicate their relationship with their peers and their teachers later on. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about this social emotional chapter kind of jump all around the highlight tour of social and emotional development is parenting styles. And parenting styles, this view of parenting styles was developed by Bromrand. And we have 4 different kinds. And they're being measured on kind of 2 different kind of spectrums. So we'll see control as a spectrum, so control versus autonomy, and we'll see kind of acceptance as the other one. So kind of think of it as like a crosshatch where we'll have 4 quadrants, 2 intersecting lines. And we'll see authoritative parents are our most beneficial parenting type. These parents are really high on acceptance and they're high on autonomy and control. So they are really, we have both of those things. We have high control and we have high acceptance. They still give their children autonomy. They still give them opportunities to make decisions for themselves, but they do so in a way that's really appropriate for the development of the child. So, letting a 3-year-old pick out their outfit, even if it doesn't match, as long as it's weather and activity appropriate, that's something that 3-year-old and that 4-year-old and that 5-year-old can do that makes them feel like they have autonomy, like makes them feel like they get to make decisions. But that parent still maintains that control over whether it's weather appropriate, so we're not wearing a ski jacket in the heat of summer, and whether it's activity appropriate. So again, if we're going to go and hang upside down on or climb up a rock wall, a big long dress might not be an activity appropriate. So that kind of that back and forth. We'll also see that these parents are highly involved. Authoritarian parents are going to be in the kind of next quadrant. And a good way to distinguish between authoritative and authoritarian is authoritative ends in IVE, just like positive ends in IVE. So that is the most positive outcome, authoritative and positive. You can kind of link those 2 together to remember. Authoritarian, these are parents that are still very, very high on control, but are very, very low on warmth and acceptance. So these are the it's my way or the highway parents. So high levels of control, but do not offer that warmth and acceptance that we'll see with authoritative parents. And so what we'll see is we're going to have more negative outcomes. Where we do have that high level of control, which is beneficial for children, we don't have that high level of acceptance. We can see that involvement can either be too high or too low, kind of depending on kind of the individual parent. And we'll say there's going to be very low autonomy granting. So again, this is kind of my way or the highway. Permissive parents are going to be very, very high on warmth and acceptance, but they're going to be very, very low on control. This is kind of you do what you want, I love you regardless, just go and be free kind of a thing. And so what we'll see is that in terms of involvement, these parents are either have too high of involvement, like I want to be your best friend, let's do everything together, or too low of involvement because they're being very permissive in their parenting style and letting their children kind of do as they may. We'll see that this will have negative consequences as well. Even though we have that high level of warmth, we're going to have that low level of control, and so we're going to have these negative outcomes. Now, uninvolved parents or neglectful parents are going to be the one that's going to have the most negative outcomes. And this is because we're both low on warmth and low on control. And so we can really see these, the most severe cases of this is where we see like neglect of parenting responsibilities, and we can see almost abusive levels of neglect. So again, this is low warmth, this is low control, and so these kids are going to have the most risks because we have both of the good things. We're completely opposite of authoritative. We're low on both of those things. So the effects of these, we'll see that for authoritative parents, we're going to see the most positive outcomes. These kids tend to be really self-reliant. They tend to be more mature. We tend to see they've been given opportunities to make decisions for themselves, and so they're better able at doing that. We're going to see other people are going to comment on these children as being better behaved, more respectful. kind of nice to be around. We'll see peers will respond that these children are nice to be around, usually happy and happy children. Authoritative parenting, these kids tend to be more anxious, easily upset, and are going to have low self-confidence. Because they don't have that autonomy granting, we're going to see not that kind of ability to make decisions for themselves, and so it's going to be harder to have that confidence in yourself when you're not given the opportunity to make decisions for yourselves. Permissive parenting, we'll say that these kids can be impulsive, immature, and disobedient. If you don't have control, it's hard to control your own behaviors. So we'll see that impulsivity. It's going to be hard to know to follow rules in other settings. So we're going to see this disobedience. And uninvolved parents, children have, the most negative outcomes. We'll see low self-confidence, and these are the kids that are most at risk for substance abuse. Now, it's important to note in a two-parent household, both parents may not be providing the same kind of parenting. And so we'll see those results kind of mitigated depending on kind of who's the primary caretaker, who's providing the most parenting, these sorts of things. So in my own life growing up, my mom was definitely in the authoritative camp, and my dad often was in the more permissive camp. But my mom did the brunt of the parenting. And so I didn't have a lot of those negative consequences of those behaviors kind of in the outside setting. Now, if I was just at home with my dad, was I disobedient? Probably, because he did have that permissive style sometimes. And so we'll see these kinds of differences within two-parent households, and we can have a parent, and we can have even parents that aren't living together in divorce situations or separate living situations. We can have different parenting styles as well. And then children are kind of figuring out, think back to the learning chapter, I can do this in this situation, but I can't do this in this situation. And so children will pick up different rules that they could do. The things that I would do when my dad was in charge versus the things that I would do when my mom was in charge were very different things, because I had a different set of expectations from each parent in their parenting style. Into adolescence and adulthood, Marcia talks about 4 identity statuses. The first one we're going to talk about is identity achievement. This is a commitment to our values, beliefs, and goals, but this is following a period of exploration. So just like we had this kind of quadrant system for parenting styles, we're going to have this kind of quadrant system for identity status, where we have kind of commitment and we'll have exploration as the other one. So high levels of exploration, high levels of commitment, we're going to see this identity achievement. So kind of they went and figured out what they thought. They went and figured out what they believed. Identity moratorium would be kind of doing this high level of exploration, but not necessarily getting to that commitment level yet. That doesn't mean that these individuals won't get to identity achievement, that they're just not there yet. They're in identity moratorium. Identity foreclosure would be that commitment in that absence of exploration. So I know people whose parents say that they raised them to be a specific political ideology, and so they were upset when their child voted a different way. They were hoping for identity foreclosure. They were hoping that their child wouldn't explore their other options and would just commit to the political ideology that they were quote unquote raised to be. Whereas that child did go through exploration and then reached identity achievement through this commitment to values, beliefs, and goals that they actually believed based on their exploration of the issues. And then lastly, we have identity diffusion. This is kind of this apathetic state characterized by both a lack of exploration and a lack of commitment. And we're going to see this is going to have the most negative outcomes, just like identity achievement is going to have the most positive outcomes. So just like in that quadrant system for parenting, we're going to see when we've got the high on both of the good things, we have the best outcomes. When we have the low on both of the good things, we're going to have the worst outcomes. The same way we see with authoritative parenting versus neglectful, uninvolved parenting, we're going to see the same thing with identity achievement versus identity diffusion. So here's that quadrant system. Again, we're going to see high levels of commitment and high levels of exploration for identity achievement. We're going to see low levels of exploration and low levels of commitment for identity diffusion. And so those are going to be kind of the most positive versus the most negative. And then we're going to see kind of differences in between for identity foreclosure versus identity moratorium. Identity foreclosure is going to be a little bit more maladaptive because, again, that exploration never really went, and that commitment, this kind of blind following, where identity moratorium can still end up in identity achievement. We haven't made those commitments yet, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to happen. It's important to note that within this, their ethnic identity plays a role as well. So this is that attachment to one's minority group, but also attachment to the larger culture. And we'll see, well, that will kind of sometimes create a tension because sometimes one's minority group and one's larger culture aren't necessarily saying the same things, aren't necessarily supporting the same things, aren't necessarily wanting the same things. This biculturalism actually has a lot of adaptive value for identity. And so we'll see that this can almost be protective in some ways. Also, we'll see that parents and peers will really affect this identity as well. That parents who kind of can manage and counsel and monitor really kind of provide that scaffolding, like we talked about in Vygotsky, for healthy functioning and healthy development. They also provide this modeling for that as well. And so we'll see benefits for that. And again, just like we talked about with parenting style, this balance of allowing this exploration, allowing appropriate autonomy granting is going to be important. And we're going to see that peer relations will really kind of peak in importance in adolescence, early adulthood, and then we'll see kind of changes in that. So we'll see that parents start out as kind of the most important figure early in childhood, and we'll see a decline in that as peers kind of take over. And here's a graph to indicate that. So we have grade school, we have second through grading school, we have second through college, and the purple line is parents. And you can see that parents really start declining once we get kind of into middle school. And this is mean self-disclosure. So this is like what you're telling your parents. We see a decline in that as you go into middle school. That doesn't mean that they're telling people less things, but what you see is that they're telling friends more things. As we see that purple line decline, we see that red line increase. And we'll see that peers are starting to take off a more prominent role. Once we start to get into more committed relationships, we'll see that romantic partners will out kind of pace friends as well. We'll see that friends will decline once romantic partners take over, but that once we have kids again, once these individuals are married and they have children, or even if they're not married and have children, we're going to see that parents start to take on a more important role. Once you need that support of your parents to help care for your children, for advice for your children, things like that, we'll see that those parent relationships start to go back up. It's also important in terms of friendships across the lifespan. When we're very young, we tend to have a lot more friends, but a lot less kind of trusted relationships. And what we'll see is that number will go down in terms of quantity of friends, and the quality of friends will go up. So this quote, I think, is perfect. As we grow up, we realize it's less important to have lots of friends and more important to have real ones. So again, this focus on trusting relationships for those self-disclosures versus just the number of friends that we have. And so we'll see, again, across the lifespan that the number of friends may decline, but the quality of those friendships increase. The last thing that we're going to talk about is emerging adulthood. And this is something that we see in modern cultures and industrialized cultures. And it's a period from the late teens to mid-20s. And it really bridges the gap between the adolescent dependence and full independence and responsible adulthood. So I remember when I turned 18 on my 18th birthday, I remember sobbing on my mother because I was still in high school because I was a November baby. And so I remember just crying because I was now now an adult and I was now responsible for myself. That's because I didn't understand this idea of emerging adulthood. I was still in high school. I was still living at home. I was going to college. My parents were going to support me through college. Clearly, when I turned 18, I did not become a full independent and responsible adult. And that's really sometimes reflective in more modern cultures, especially when we see cultures that have higher socioeconomic statuses and in families that have higher socioeconomic statuses. And so what we'll see is this kind of range between, and this is a graph based on women, kind of their first period, which indicates kind of puberty or indicates kind of this adolescent kind of turning point versus marriage. We see that it used to be about 7.5 years in 1890. 100 years later, it had expanded 5 years in 1995. So what we see is that this kind of range, this interval of time to kind of emerging into adulthood has increased. Again, we're going to see this is most likely in higher socioeconomic statuses. It's most likely in industrialized countries. So we're less likely to see this in a rural, tribe in South America. We're not going to see that same level of we're not going to see this emerging adulthood idea like the way we would see it, in a affluent Canadian community. We'll see these differences. So again, this is this kind of idea of extended adolescence. This is something that Arnett talked about. And Arnett says that there are 5 key features. Identity exploration, like we talked about in Marcia. So kind of figuring out who you want to be, figuring out what you're going to do with your life. And that's what we see college is a lot of, right? Like, what are you going to major in? Like, what are you going to do when you get out of college? And so we see that college can often kind of be a factor in that kind of emerging adulthood. This instability, because we are exploring, we don't necessarily have stability in who we are, who we have relationships, what we're going to do, where we live, these sorts of things. And we also have this really self-focus. What am I going to do? What is my responsibility? Instead of kind of having this focus on others around us. Feeling in between of both being a kid and an adult, kind of this in-between stage, but it also being this age of possibilities where because of this exploration, we have different options available to us. Okay, this ends our conversation on socio-emotional development through the lifespan. Thanks.